Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. I'll be your host and moderator as we present Balancing Change and Acceptance. During this broadcast, I'm joined by Patria Wynn, a Center for Enriching Relationships Associate Marriage and Family Therapist. Ms. Wynn earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from California State University in San Marcos, California, and her Master of Arts from National University in Counseling Psychology, San Diego, California. In a few moments, Patria will provide you with keen insights for balancing change and acceptance. She and I will then proceed and respond to questions while providing you with practical relationship tools. Today's event takes place before a live audience and live streaming while offering practical, biblical, and scientific solutions. It's like having your own Christian mental health relationship specialist within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Well, welcome again to My Therapist Says, and I want to quickly just welcome our guest, Patria Wynn. Glad you're here this evening, and you'll be presenting for the first 20 minutes of our production, and then if you have a question at any time, raise that 3x5 card in the air, and we will pick that up and bring that to the front here to respond to your questions. Would you join me in welcoming Patria Wynn?
Hi, everyone. My name again is Patria Wynn, and it really is such an honor to be here tonight. So thank you so much for having me. Tonight I'm going to be speaking on balancing change and acceptance. And this is a topic that's really, really near and dear to my heart, both as a human being and as a practitioner. And so my prayer tonight is that I can act as a vehicle that in some small way does this topic justice. So let's start with the basic premise that we all have something that we would like to change. And to make that a little bit more digestible or palatable, I'm going to break this down into 3 categories. So this might be a behavioral pattern that we'd like to change. So that would be something along the lines of a set of actions that we find ourselves in on a regular basis that we don't really like that we're doing. This might be in the form of an internal pattern. So when we speak about internal patterns in psychology, we're talking about feelings and thoughts, right? And patterns are the best to target. That's really where the gold is. Because we can see ourselves in these repeated internal behaviors, if you will, a way of thinking, a way of feeling. Let's say we find ourselves in that way and we don't really like it. So let's use really quickly a couple of examples. So behavioral patterns might be stress eating. I think that's a really relatable one. When we get stressed, we find ourselves in that bag of chips before we even know what's happening. Maybe the internal pattern could be negative self-talk, right? Instead of turning to God, we find ourselves instead in these negative thought patterns in which we're really chastising ourselves in a way that just really doesn't feel very loving. Or this might be a situational pattern, right? And situational patterns can include relationship issues, right? It might be with one particular person or one particular situation, or we might notice a commonality there. Like, oh, this person really reminds me of mom, for instance. So I'm going to ask you right now to bring to mind one thing that you would really like to change. And just internally think about that for just a moment, because that's going to really facilitate and guide the rest of this conversation. So let's also say another basic premise, that there are barriers to change. Because if there weren't barriers to change, we would have already done it, right? I mean, these are situations that are causing us suffering. These are situations that are deeply uncomfortable at the very, very least. And our natural knee-jerk reaction as human beings is to try to escape that discomfort. So if this was easy to find a way out of, if these things were easy to change, we would have already done it. So we're going to talk about some of those barriers today. And thirdly, today, I'm going to talk to you about the role of acceptance in all of this. And I love these two concepts together because they really do sound like opposites. And we are going to talk about that. So the role of acceptance, we can think of that almost as one of the key ingredients to change. So I put up a quote here. This is by an American psychologist, Carl Rogers. And it's perfect for this little talk. And it says, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." So when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. So when we're most open to change is actually when we accept ourselves just as we are in this very present moment. So next, let's talk about those barriers to change. And this is in no way a comprehensive list. There are many barriers, but these are just a few that I came up with here tonight. So one might be closing our eyes to the truth. So maybe a good indicator of that is, for instance, let's say there's something really hard at our job. We come home, and night after night, someone who really cares about us is saying, "Hey, you want to talk about it? You seem frustrated." I say, "No, I do not want to talk about it. I don't even want to think about it." And that's okay sometimes. We don't always want to talk. We don't always want to think about the hard stuff. But if this is always happening, we might be really closing our eyes to some realities that are in our lives. Another key thing might be absence of safe space. So absence of safe space, it's not a good environment for change. So that safe space, that's something that we create in a counseling session, right? But it's also something that we experience in contemplative prayer, right? And we all have our own experience of what that safe space looks like. But really, it's an experience of unconditional love. It's a space in which we feel accepted no matter what. And we're going to talk more about that too. Or just resistance to change. And I love this picture because, this horse, he's really digging his heels in. And don't we feel that way sometimes? So there's a rigidity with that stance, right? There's maybe a comfort in the known discomfort. Like, I really don't like this situation, but at least I know what to expect, right? So it's scary going into an unknown situation, and that can happen with change. So clinging to the familiar is kind of the other side of that. And also guilt and shame. So when we find ourselves not feeling unconditionally loved, when we don't have that safe space, it can bring up even more guilt and shame. And then resistance to being seen as broken. So this can come up in situations like, has anyone ever said to you, someone who, again, probably cares, or feels at least close enough to be able to say this, "Hey, you really need to change this." And I'm thinking, I don't need fixing, or who are you to tell me what I need to change, right? So that kind of resistance, it's really a barrier to change. So let's now talk about acceptance. So 2 Corinthians 12:9 through 10 states, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness, for when I am weak, I am strong.'" So, for when I am weak, I am strong. So that's sort of the opposite of that stance that we just saw that horse doing, the digging the heels in, really leaning back. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to move. I'm not going to budge. Because we're being asked here to admit our weakness, right? And that's really a backing down. And in that space, we're letting the light in. And I picture this a lot in counseling sessions, something like this. Like light coming through, and only then can we really feel like we can see it all, and we can't change what we can't see. So then the question comes, why would we want to accept something that's really causing us suffering? So the next slide is barriers to acceptance, because there's barriers to those too. So one barrier to acceptance is an avoidance of strong emotions, because they're going to come up, right? When we really look at a problem clearly, when we really, I'm going to ask you to call to mind right now that one thing you said you'd said in your mind would really like to change. When we think deeply about that, if we were to really see it clearly, some feelings are going to come up, right? And there's a natural avoidance to that, to experiencing that. So then really, with that clear seeing of the situation, we're then going to take it just one step further. And that's a clear seeing of the emotions that it brings up, right? So, okay, what is that right now? Oh, that's shame. Or, oh, that's rage even. That's deep sadness. That's grief. These are strong emotions. But in identifying them, again, we're taking that acceptance just a step further, and we're sitting with it. So another thing is that this feels really foreign. It can feel extremely foreign to be asked to accept something, right, that we actually want to change. And one of the other barriers to this is that these are some synonyms, if you will, that I've heard talked about in terms of acceptance, right? Some words that really feel like acceptance, but they're not. And these are some of those words. Being passive, condoning, complacency. And I'm going to shift gears here by saying acceptance is not. Complacency. Acceptance is not approval or giving up on a problem or giving in or settling or minimizing. And I think that developing acceptance can feel a lot like developing a new muscle group. You've ever worked in your garden? I know I've been working in my garden a little bit more because it's been so hot and just trying to keep everything alive. And I felt like a soreness in my back, like in a place that it's like, I didn't even know I had muscles there. And I'm thinking, well, I do now, right? So it's a new muscle group sometimes, and it can feel really different. And so balancing change and acceptance, what does that look like? So it might mean applying unconditional love for myself, even while working on my personal flaws, right? Because when we're saying, hey, accept reality just as it is, what we're not saying is accept reality just as it is and believe it can't change. We're not saying accept myself just as I am and believe I can't change. We're just saying accept it where it is first. So honesty about personal reality, acceptance, while also having honesty about the fact that I wish to change the reality. Seeing a chain of events, acceptance, that leads to a problem, because it's a complex chain, if you really get into it. But then also seeing my role in that complex chain. I'm going to use another example here. Let's say I have 3 friends, all of which separately are coming to me and saying, I don't think I can spend as much time around you because I feel really judged every time I'm around you. Well, I might say, well, I've always prided myself on being an opinionated person. I don't see what the problem is. You asked for my opinion, or, well, you should look at your life. There's a lot to change, right? Or I might take a step back and see that that's what we call a pattern, right? Multiple people are saying the same thing. So there's something that I'm doing that's creating that state in others. And that's where there's an opening for change. So that's acknowledging my own role in the causation. And then also that while we're not responsible for causing all of our problems, because we're definitely not, we are responsible for dealing with them, because no one else is going to do it for us. So, lastly, there's a quote, and it's written by an ancient poet. I came across this quote probably 15 years ago. And the quote is, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." And that, to me, encapsulates that stance of acceptance and the place from which we might actually want and be able to, more importantly, create real change in our lives. So I think we're going to take questions now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, we have some cards that are coming up. If you have some questions for us as we continue on balancing change and acceptance. So when you think about these patterns, these patterns that happen to us, could we talk for just a moment about patterns that maybe others see in us that may cause us not to change? Let's start there if we can. That we can have patterns that we behave in. Say we are more critical. Let's go with one of the things that you had shared, that we're a bit judgmental, and maybe we have a friend that brings that to our attention. Actually, good friends help us, right? Have you ever had a good friend and you walk out in public, and my wife will help me with this, and Robin is here this evening. She'll help me and say, "Honey, I think you got a little smudge right here." Have you ever been in a group where you had the smudge, and then you're talking to people for 30 minutes, and you walk out of there, and you, for whatever reason, you're in front of a mirror and you see the smudge, and you think, "I didn't have any friends in there that were willing to tell me that I had a smudge on my face." Or it could be worse, I guess. But the idea is they see that smudge, which may be a critical spirit. And we're seeing that, and you talked about how we can somehow apply unconditional love to self, which I think is the starting place for this. How can I apply that? How can I apply when someone else in my life is being hopefully kind and trying to help me to become a better person? How can we apply unconditional love to self to be able to say, accept that, and then perhaps as we're talking about this change a behavior, a change, a particular attitude, where would you start with that? If you have a client in your office, and how would you start with that, Patricia?
It's a great question. So one thing that comes to mind is inner child work. And it's something we use in the therapy world. And we need to find access point, something that feels genuine, where we can really look at ourselves with that unconditional love or unconditional positive regard. And one exercise that I love to use is called inner child work. And very basically put, it's thinking of ourselves, right, or another small child that we really, really care for, that when they make a mistake, we want to talk to them and show them, like, okay, there are better ways to go about this, but that we wouldn't love them any less, right? So if we can actually access that through our own experience of our own inner child, right? And we can use contemplative prayer here, right? We can close our eyes and really imagine that we're sitting with our, say, 5-year-old self. So it's finding those little access points where we can have an internal experience. And it's really starting with that emotional state. I think that we can experience the unconditional love for self.
So let's say with that, because that's so well said, let's say I'm your patient and I'm coming in and I wish I could receive criticism or someone giving me insight, and I'm very rigid and unable to receive that. And then you're working with me, and let's suppose, which I've seen in some of my patients over the years, let's suppose that I didn't, as a 5-year-old, receive much nurture or love. So when I would skin my knee, I would run to my parent, and they would say, hey, just get that cleaned up and get back on your bicycle. Hey, stop that. Stop crying. I'll give you something to cry about. So that's what I experienced. Well, I really didn't. But let's say I did, and I'm your patient. So I'm not able to really access a place in my life when you're doing childhood work, and access a place where I felt like there was this unconditional love. I think you were mentioning Carl Rogers, who talked about if I can just be who I am and be it openly. Another one of his statements, that idea of just truly being open with myself. But since I didn't have that nurturing, I'm very closed off to people and have a lot of defenses. I don't want people to criticize me. So I'm coming to you. Let's say I'm saying that my wife would like to share some things I could improve on, but I don't think I need to improve on anything. And you're trying to help me access that early childhood. What would you do with a hard case like me? Someone that's not easily accessible to any moment of nurturing in my life.
Well, I would try to be an emotionally corrective experience for that person. So sometimes we just need one experience of someone feeling what we would call unconditional positive regard, but really it's an experience of unconditional love. So safe space, again.
Safe space, okay.
Right? So trying to create an environment, at least in that therapy room, right? And the therapy room isn't the only place that this happens. But this person needs to experience that, right? Because that's a very harsh environment to be raised in. It's a very harsh environment to perpetuate. And there would be a rigidity there.
How would the person, this is very helpful because I just know that some people would say, how do I even recognize that? Because some people are not able to recognize a nurturing moment. If I've never really had a nurturing moment, and I'm not saying all people, I'm just starting there, is if I've not had nurturing moments, how would I recognize that corrective experience that you're suggesting? How would you do that with me? Well, let's say I'm talking about, say, my wife. So I'm talking about my wife. I'm your patient. I'm not, but I couldn't be your patient. But I'm just saying that I'm your patient and your client, and I'm saying my wife, Robin, is really trying to help me to see these things, and I become very reactive to her. I don't like it, and I say, stop it, or I'm done. I don't want to talk about it anymore, and I walk away. How would you help me? How would that session go?
Well, first I would ask what's coming up for you right now.
Okay.
Right. You're saying that you feel rigid and that you want to walk away, but what's the feeling right before that?
The feeling is scared, I think. If I could
Okay.
get to my feeling is feeling scared that someone's going to take advantage of me, and then I'm all alone. And all alone. Yeah, being alone.
Okay.
That's being alone is another thing I would say.
Right.
And I'm scared. And I'm a bit angry, too. That comes up when I say that.
Right. Right. So you're feeling a defensiveness against that fear.
Yeah, it's me against the world kind of a thing. Even though my wife is lovely, but it feels like I'm all alone in it.
Right. Absolutely. And then you feel isolated.
I do feel isolated. And a lot of times I'll just isolate myself. I'll walk away.
Absolutely.
It tends to be the best thing. When I walk away, I don't feel as scared and I don't feel as angry. And I certainly actually feel less alone. Isn't that strange? Why would I feel alone when I walk away from my wife?
Well, because you are alone then. You just separated yourself, right?
But I feel better, but I shouldn't feel better. But yet I feel alone.
There's no fear of rejection anymore because he's already walked away.
Okay.
So I might bring this into the room actually next. I might ask this hypothetical client.
This hardcore client of yours. Is this me?
Well, he or she is in a lot of pain.
Okay.
Right? And I might ask him or her, what are you feeling right now? Right? So you're sharing these things with me, these things that are really hard to talk about. And I'm sitting here with you. And what are you experiencing right now? And sometimes we have to bring it into the room. Right? So again, going back to trying to create at least one example of safe space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's go to, with that as an introduction, that's very helpful, doing a little bit of role play here initially, this is one of the first questions that's being raised. My son will be 18 next month. He never really cared about school. He is into smoking weed, always around bad influences. What should I do, even though I've been praying day, night, and hours? He has ADHD. He never wants to talk about school or anything. What should I do? And he doesn't want to go to a psychologist or anyone who may help him. So my son will be 18 next month. What do we do about the change and acceptance in someone like that? That would be very difficult. What would be some ideas that you might have?
Well, as parents, it's extremely hard. Mm-hmm. And the reality still exists that we can't change anyone else. So I might ask about the dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. So if there's any small thing that person might be able to change within themselves, some way that they might be able to access the relationship, even though it sounds like he is really, really, again, similar pattern, pushing the whole family away is what I'm gathering. And that is hard because he's about to become an adult, and I'm sure that's very scary. There's no should do, no one right way to act, but definitely there would be a desire for him to change, I'm sure. And also the need to really sit with him and show him, again, that stance of acceptance that we've been talking about, that stance of no matter what you do, I love you, which I know we experience as parents.
That would be very difficult, wouldn't it, as a parent? And there is a person who's asking this question, obviously, in this room. And that would create a lot of fear and anxiety for a person who's asking this question. It's very difficult in parenting not to feel very personal about our children and feel very deeply. And because we feel so deeply, we could stand in harm's way for our children. That's really mirrored and exampled by Jesus, who actually did stand in harm's way for us. He who is without sin became sin on our behalf. And so what's difficult about caring so deeply is that it might be that I, as the parent in this situation, might already be critical of, say, that child who's now almost 18, so it's a young adult, of course, for the behavior. So it's difficult for me, going back to your acceptance, it may be difficult for me as the parent to actually genuinely accept my child who's now a young adult, and I have great fears for them. Anyone that's been a parent knows that fear is one of the greatest despondent places to experience parenting, because we have so many fears. We want the best for our children. I can still remember when our children were birthed, and I was in the room with my lovely wife, Robin, and as those children were birthed, I remember Robin looking at me with tears in her eyes, and I had tears in my eyes, and first said, "Can anyone believe there's not a God?" And we see these precious two children. They were birthed differently. They're 18 months apart, but the first one, I remember that, and I said, "Yes." And then her second phrase was, "And I know that without a doubt now I could stand in harm's way." Now, when I tell that story to my university students who are 18 to 22, not married yet, no children, they look at me in the deer's eyes, like a deer in the light, and they're just like going, "I have no idea what you're saying, Prof. It just sounds kind of nerdy the way you're telling it." You're telling this personal story that we really didn't want to hear after all. But that idea of standing in harm's way for a child is indigenous, because it's the fifth commandment that we have, is to honor father and mother, that relationship. So going back to the fact that it could be that I, as a parent, I might have fear that when I try to talk, I'm going back to kind of what you were saying, that when I'm trying to talk to my child, I'm judging them, critiquing them, cannot do it in an unbiased way, if that makes sense. You were sort of talking about this. So maybe a skill for those who are parenting, and particularly in this case, that it may be that we're only seeing the negative when there's truly powerful gifts in this person. Does that make sense? You're so close to it, or I would be so close to it, it would be difficult. This is where I really believe when we ask the Lord to help us to see through His eyes, through Jesus' eyes, rather than our own fear or our own misunderstanding or our biased view of that child. That can sound rather simple, but it's profound because it's not my words. It's actually example through Jesus, is to be able to see through His eyes and actually take even more time contemplating prayer. Your thoughts about that? Yeah.
So one phrase that comes to mind is the importance of separating the human being from the behavior, right? So again, this is not condoning that behavior. This is not going along with it or giving into it, or that's not what we mean by acceptance. This is accepting the human being. And I imagine in this situation also that actually at the root of that pain of seeing a child that you see so much greatness in, so much potential, having these behaviors that sounds like are really destructive and hard to see, right? But if you hear what I just said, it's actually because we see the greatness in that person. So if we focus on that piece, the human being, and not the behaviors that they are doing, then that's where the acceptance lies. And that's what the person feels, right? Is that experience of acceptance.
That acceptance, that's a really key phrase. I was with a group of university students in supervision. We have like people, about 8 people in a group, excuse me. And I was suggesting this morning, I said, you know, and when we're working with people, and we just watched a video of a client, and I said, it's quite remarkable when we just sit with the person and allow them to share their experience. Oftentimes in life, or many people in life, do not have another person who will listen to them unconditionally. You were talking about that. That's the beauty of the Christian message, is that God never shames us. He accepts us. Of course, sin separates us from Him, and Jesus made a way that when He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and that we can experience God through Christ. But that acceptance is really critical, even in the case of this situation. Learning how to maybe accept where that child is, who's a young adult, and their experience. Talking about this idea of kind of accepting ourselves, this second question leads right into that. And this question, by the way, we have room for more questions if you want to raise your 3x5 card in the air, and they'll bring it to us here. That this really ties in well with what I believe you were talking about. I often berate myself for mistakes or errors in judgment. I in ways I would never do to others. So this person is saying, you know, I often berate myself for my mistakes or errors in judgment in ways I would never do to others. How can I begin to change this? This is a very common statement that people will make. If you think about it, early on in life, we're critiqued very quickly by others. No, don't do that. Don't touch that. You shouldn't do that. Don't throw your sippy cup at your brother. You know, these various things that we're commonly told and critiqued about ourselves. I often share with young parents that if they can move in the adolescent years from critiquing to consulting, where that critiquing process, like you're not quite doing it well, to consulting, which means perhaps they can ask the right question or ask questions instead of my giving them answers. But in this case, you've had lots of patients, I'm sure, that have experienced this. This is really about the idea of acceptance. How would you go about that? I often berate myself for mistakes or errors in judgment in ways I would never do to others. How can I begin to change this?
So that internal self-punishment, that berating of oneself, so common, right? I think probably most of us have some experience of that. And I think it's really important to be able to discern why, right? These ways of being, they don't just come out of nowhere, right? We're not crazy. We have reasons for doing things. And so one possible reason might be, well, if I figure out what my flaws are first, then no one can get to it before me, right? Then I can be right. Like, oh, I know. I already had that figured out about myself. There's nothing you have on me, right? Or it might be a way of, like, perceived purification, right? Like, well, I did this thing, and if I really beat myself up enough, it makes it okay. But whatever the reason, I think it's important to know it. Because then it's not just this behavior that's coming out of left field, if you will. We know the step just behind that, what happens before that self-punishment comes up, that really berating of oneself. And that's really important to know.
Can you give an example, like what maybe you had a patient, a client, where it comes up and the ability to recognize it?
Yeah.
Do you have a way of describing what that's like for a person?
Well, the first one I used was one that came right to mind. Okay. And not just from one, but I've seen this many times before. And this idea of, okay, so let's say the behavior that we're really beating ourselves up for is poor performance at work, right? So a perception that I really haven't performed according to what was expected of me. And before anyone can say anything about that performance, I'm already right there in my head, right? I'm already thinking about how bad it was, how much I bombed it, right? And there might be even more intense phrases, if you will, coming to mind, like, wow, I'm really stupid, or I'm really a loser, or I'm never going to amount to anything, right? So all of these are cognitive distortions, but it's part of that really painful berating that we can find ourselves in, even if the general perception at that meeting wasn't that you bombed it at all, right? So say then, in a counseling session, for instance, we then discover that the reason why I'm doing that is because I had an early childhood experience of really being berated for things I didn't even know were going on with me, right? Like, oh, you're so sloppy all the time because your clothes are wrinkled, or you never have your things organized in your bag. And I start getting this idea of myself that other people are viewing me that way. And so then I start deciding, well, I'm going to beat them to the punch. I'm going to have all of my flaws figured out to where if someone says, do you have a problem? I can say, do you want a list? I have it. And then we would work on, does that really serve you? Right? Because I'm going through the punishment every single time I think I might have made a mistake, as opposed to giving myself some measure of grace, doing my best, and if someone has a criticism, I'm probably going to hear about it. And if someone is going to be so critical that it's destructive to me, well, maybe that's a situation I want to find my way out of. So sometimes these behaviors, they come for a very good purpose, like wanting to be right, wanting to have it figured out before we're so hurt by somebody else, like maybe we've had an experience of as a child. Maybe that was a teacher, maybe it was a parent, maybe it was even a friend or a sibling. But then we can find our way out of, through self-awareness, out of, that pattern of thinking through self-awareness about where that's coming from and recognition of if it's even serving me. And again, only with having enough acceptance, having enough safe space, can we go through that process.
So if we stay with those thoughts, this is a little tangential in nature. If we stay with those negative self-talks, self-talking, I'm not good enough, or I'm disorganized because a parent said your backpacks, you're always kind of disorganized. And that begins to tell me who I am. I'm accepting that. I share this with young people. It's not always the case just with this audience here tonight, but oftentimes there's what we call an inadequate level of differentiation. So I cannot, as an adult, if it's coming from my early childhood, if I cannot, as an adult, realize that's what someone else says to me, maybe their opinion, it's not necessarily 100% true of who I am, then I can differentiate my feelings from the other person. If I cannot do that, it's likely I'll fall in love with someone who will criticize me. I'll be attracted to someone who'll keep that pattern going because it feels very normal. And so I'm staying with my childhood pattern. Dr. Murray Bone will talk about this in-depthly, about how then I will not have that level of differentiation. So then there needs to be assistance in somehow changing that self-talk, which is what you're referring to. And actually, this next question asks us to go a little deeper with this idea of acceptance. And this person has asked, how can we tell the difference between true acceptance and something else? So we're focused on this idea of acceptance. So how can we tell the difference between true acceptance and something else? I was trying to lead us into that by sharing a little bit of theory that suggests how we've taken on that statement from another person, and now it really is our integrity. It's who we are. We really believe that, even though that may not be the case. So how would you describe that, Patria? How can we tell the difference between true acceptance and something else?
So what are you saying that something else might be, Dr. Welsh?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. Someone had asked this question. I'm assuming we always leave this autonomous so that we don't know whose question it is. Leave some autonomy, excuse me. So I'm assuming that between true acceptance and maybe we think we have good acceptance, but we don't. This is really at the core of emotional empathy. To have self-empathy is such a critical piece to develop in young children. If you ever work with young children, that's one of the critical pieces, is that they have some self-empathy. Self-empathy would be, oh, I just messed that art piece up. Well, honey, let's see. Let's take where you are. Can we go in a different direction with it? Do you have some ideas about it? So you're allowing the child to realize that a mistake can be corrected and may be built upon. Maybe even more than that, but that's quite abstract, even in and of itself, depending upon the childhood age. So how can we discern as a person if I'm really self-accepting, or maybe I think it's kind of pseudo, meaning that I believe I am self-accepting, but I'm really not, because when a troubled time comes, I'm really hard on myself, and I cannot tolerate that anxiety very well. So then I go to coping mechanisms, like eating the bag of chips like you talked about earlier. By the way, I love chips, and I had too many on my way here. My wife, I'm going to blame it on Robin, she gave me extra chips in my bag, so I'm talking to her on the phone as I'm eating chips, and I ate the whole bag that she gave me. It wasn't a full bag, but it was partial. But how do we... So
that example didn't come out of nowhere for me either.
So how do we come to the place where we might have an idea that we are fully accepting who we are, within reason, realizing that other people are going to help us to show our flaws, and there's a part of us that we cannot see. I think you brought that up in a recent group meeting on Johari Window, the 4 quadrants and the one piece that we cannot see but others can see.
Yep.
So what would you say about that, this idea? How can we tell the difference between maybe full acceptance and something other than that?
So this is how I know I'm an individual counselor, right? Because I knew this was going to be hard for me when there's a question. I'm like, what do you mean? Tell me more. So I'm going to just say that I think that if it's not true acceptance, there'll be a sense of rigidity or harshness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that rigidity or harshness might be really easily covered up, like how we say that superiority complexes are really inferiority complexes in disguise, right? When we think, oh, I accept myself no matter what without condition, that might be covering up some deep pain about some perceived shortcomings that we really are having a hard time looking at. But there will be an internal experience of harshness or rigidity. So when I say harshness, right, even if I'm thinking I'm accepting myself, I'm really having some nagging thoughts or an internal uncomfortable feeling when something does go wrong. And the rigidity would come up more interpersonally, like with other people. So when I'm criticized, I'm not able to accept that constructive criticism, assuming it's constructive criticism. So probably those two words, those are the first things that come to mind for me. What about you, Dr. Walsh?
Yeah, there's a malleable part of us if we're more in a healthy position to say, it sounds like you have an opinion of me. This sounds like a therapist, but excuse me for saying, it would be like, it sounds like you have an opinion of me. I might need some time to think about what you said. I'm not sure if I believe it or not, and I may have to dig deeper to see if that I believe as well as you do about me. You know, so there's a level of empathy by giving yourself space. If somebody says something to you, allowing yourself to have space to say, I'm not sure if I agree with that, and just allowing yourself to say, can you give me some time to think about that? You don't have to, if we're rigid and it's harsh, no, I didn't do that. I don't do that. I know you do. You know, that's what we tend to do, you know. Oh, you want me to tell you when you did that? And I'll tell you. That's a harshness and a rigidity, right? You want a relationship to have, we call it reciprocity. That means there is a fluid. It's kind of a circular fluid about it that we can, you've been in a banter back and forth, having fun in a relationship where it's kind of fluid and there's a serendipitousness about it, if you will. So that can be helpful. So thank you for staying on that for just a moment, because I think I'd like to go now to some change. And if we have a level of acceptance, how do we move into change? And here's a question that sometimes change is positive, such as marriage. This is another question. Like a new baby, that would be change. Or retirement, and yet one feels lost or overwhelmed. What are some strategies? This is really getting to the heart of the question tonight with our title about change and acceptance. What are some strategies to approaching a major life change? Now, keep in mind as we look at this question, we are all in that process. We're all in the process of change when you think about it. Just think about it this way. Yesterday, you either had a little more money or a little less than you do today. That's change, right? I wish I had a little more. That's what I would love, that kind of change. There's some of you in this, I know I'm looking around, there's some of you that you've had your children launched. They're young adults and they've launched. That's a major change. My wife and I are empty nesters. It's like that commercial, have you ever seen on TV, where they're crying as they're packing the car with their daughter, and they're both, the parents are crying, and, oh, honey, we're going to miss you, and they get her car packed, and they give a hug, and then she starts to get in the car, she comes back and gets another hug, everybody's crying, and she's crying, she gets in the car, and as she's driving away, they're crying, and when she turns around the corner, the parents each give each other a big high five, and they're off with their bicycles having a great afternoon. I'm just kidding, but that's a change. Actually, our wife did a little bit. We did that a little bit, Robin and I, not on our bicycles, but that's a change. And there are many, many different types of change. You may have a new colleague. You may have a colleague retired. You may have a new boss. Your child may be changing and acting in ways you'd never experienced before. Those are all changes. In fact, in the psychological tests, oftentimes we see some of great changes, like a promotion can create a lot of anxiety for someone, something very positive because it's a change. Have you ever gone someplace like even at church? My wife and I, we like to sit in the same spot. Why do we like to sit in the same spot? Because to sit in another spot is change, right? We tend to seek non-change. We like things in a similar way, but they're always changing. So with that, when we talk about this, what are some strategies? but for a change? What can we do? Except for giving each other a big high five if your children are launched, that sort of thing.
Well, I wouldn't want to completely devalidate, right, that desire for a constant, because that's such a human quality, isn't it?
Yes.
We like to know where our roots are, right, where we can dig them in real deep and get comfortable. So first, I think we need to look at what are still some constants, because it's okay to want that, right? So as people of faith, we got one, right? Mm-hmm. And then also gathering in our circle. So we're going to need support for a major change. Even if, like Dr. Welsh mentioned, it's a really positive change, right? Like a move to a nicer house, or a promotion, or a new relationship, or a pregnancy, right? That all things that we're excited about. Mm-hmm. So it's still change. It still alters the homeostasis, if you will. And so first we need to acknowledge that there's some discomfort there. Like, okay, I kind of thought I could go on autopilot in certain ways, and now it's not just somebody's in my seat at church, it's something bigger, right? So starts there, right? Getting some constants in order, and acknowledging that we like that. And then when we go about the change, it's important to not just say, this is uncomfortable, and oh, you know me, whenever I move, it's uncomfortable. I don't know what it is. But to really think about why. What is it about that particular change that's really messing with my equilibrium? Maybe my desk got moved, and I really loved watching that one little bird couple out the window, and that was part of my lunch break, and I don't have that anymore, and now I'm really not kind of finding this nice little calm lunch break like I used to. It might be something really small, or it might be something really huge, like leaving a job that you've been at for many, many years. So then you're not just losing that job, but you're losing maybe a sense of family, a sense of community. So acknowledging what all those things are, and then to the best of our ability, finding not replacements, but things to satisfy those same needs, right? Because some of our needs are being stripped in any one of those situations.
It's a very good point in the idea of not finding replacements. That's what we tend to do naturally, like we might find a replacement for a loss. This is what addicts do. Addicts will tend to replace what they've stopped in their behavior. I still remember in the hospital setting, one young man came up and he said to me, and actually in this hospital you could smoke in certain parts of the hospital. So he was smoking a cigar, and I'd not seen him smoke a cigar before, and he said, Doc, I'm now 3 weeks sober. I'm no longer drinking, and I'm excited about it. I'm just here for the afternoon. And I was excited to hear that. And so I said, his name is not John, but I said, John, I've not seen you smoke a cigar before. Have you always smoked a cigar? And he said, no, I think I recently started smoking cigars. I said, well, how long have you been smoking cigars? Oh, about 3 weeks. And what he was saying is he had replaced one behavior for another. And in addictions, we tend to do that. Because in addictions, oftentimes, that's not the topic tonight. However, in addictions, we're not embracing the pain. We're trying to replace it with something else. And so oftentimes, if we go to replacing, we're not grieving the loss. So I've had families, and I know there are a couple families here tonight that are here, and specifically you've had children or a child even move out of the state. And it's a wonderful experience and you're thrilled, but what can happen is we can feel guilty if we're enjoying life without that child around. And that can cause us to go back to early childhood and say, you're not very caring, are you? And we can go back to shame experiences early on in our development just by virtue of a young adult leaving our home. And then if I don't grieve that loss, then I'll probably do some sort of replacement behavior. Now, replacement behavior isn't like, say, I miss that child who's now grown and I'm grieving it, and I think I'm going to start up bicycling, because that could be healthy for me. But what it's doing is trying to disable my ability to feel for that child or to feel that experience, which is where you started this evening, which is really important. Oftentimes we negate, without knowing, the ability to have grieving as our close friend. And we don't grieve the losses in life. And you can even see someone's gait if you've been the way they walk and the way they hold themselves, him or her, in the sense of how they did earlier in their life, if they're carrying a lot of this pain, because their gait is different. Actually, the way they stand up erect or not, they can be carrying a lot of that. So learning how to grieve those losses by journaling or outright being able to cry. It took me almost 30 years as a young adult to really learn how to allow myself to cry. I was told not to do that. That was the language for me as a male. Big boys don't cry. And so learning how to actually let those feelings come up and then allow them to be expressed. Boys can cry as good as girls, and as well as girls, I should say, my language here. That can happen. So there's different things like doing journaling, actually celebrating moments from the past. That can bring up emotion. I love Barbara Johnson's book, Put a Geranium in Your Hat and Be Happy. It's a very wonderful book that talks about grieving. The whole book is about it. She used to, when we had bookstores, Christian bookstores, she had a whole section. She never planned that, but that's a wonderful book. Pain is inevitable, she says. So put a geranium in your hat and be happy. That's the name of the book, Barbara Johnson. But what are your thoughts about this when we have these strategies and how to live with change?
You said it so well, Dr. Welsh. And one thing that was coming to mind as you were speaking, all the way from, this replacement behavior from the alcoholic that's now using cigars, and is that we're not actually replacing the drinking, right? I mean, that's the language that we use, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is we're replacing that behavior. But there's something that the drinking was giving that person who was perpetually turning to alcohol, that was an emotional need, right? So it's important that we look at what that emotional need was, not just, well, yeah, that's my behavior, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, in the example of leaving a workplace that we've been at for a long time, somebody gave me this example earlier, and it's proving itself very helpful, is let's say the emotional need was a sense of purpose in a workplace I've been in for 3 decades. Let's say it was a sense of community and belonging. Let's say it was the feeling of being respected, right? Those are all very valid and also very different. So how we might go about having that same feeling state is going to be different based on what it is in particular that we're grieving with that change.
And I think it's so true. We really are a people that crave interaction, healthy interaction. And oftentimes we will isolate when we have, say, a loss or a change, because we're not sure how to purpose our lives. Sometimes that interaction, in fact, some of the more current research would suggest, I'm not digressing to addicts again, but addiction, we oftentimes isolate people with addictions instead of integrate. Because of their behavior, we don't like their behavior. We want it to change, right? So we tend to isolate, when actually the research is showing that if we could somehow generate environments in which people connected relationally, there would be better results. So I think that's very helpful. We had several text questions that came in that I thought I would go to. These are questions for tonight. They just came in. This is a question related to another type of change. My parents are going through a hard time right now as I'm about to move out of the house going into college. I want to help them the best I can, but I feel very burdened and they are constantly bringing me in their fights. How do I help them through this change without them feeling like I don't care, without emotionally stressing myself out? Thank you. So it's the question, they're going through a hard time. I want to help them, but I feel burdened, and they're constantly bringing me into their fights. That's a tough question. That's a tough situation to be in. How would you, as the therapist, someone came in and asked you that question, Patria?
So I might use a little bit of psychoeducation first. It sounds like, without more details, that this person may be in a pattern of what we call triangulation. So, very simply put, two individuals are in relationship, right? And they're bringing in a third individual to sort of arbitrate, or at the very least become involved in that primary relationship. So it sounds like this young person is being brought into their parents' fights. And I would say also that even those of us who are working in the field, right, who often work with families in these kind of situations where there's fighting going on and discord and lots of misunderstanding or whatever might be coming up between these parents, that we can't be that same role in our families' lives. So even with the training, it's called a dual role in psychology, right? We can't do that in our personal lives because we can't really see clearly. We're just too close. And so it no longer is effective. So some amount of holding space for or accepting a little bit more at a distance might be appropriate in this situation. And also sometimes a conversation with the people. You're saying, I deeply care and I'm deeply concerned. Of course, these are my words, not theirs, so they would find their own. But something that feels authentic and genuine, because this young person sounds genuinely concerned, and from my perspective, sounds like they genuinely care enough to ask this question. And the parents probably would love to hear that. And also that maybe they're concerned to leave. So I don't know if that...
I think it's wonderful, and I think that sometimes in those situations, just to build on what you've already eloquently suggested, is to say, I care deeply, because it might be difficult as the young person to withhold your anger and frustration, because it's very painful to see parents fighting, is to say, would use invitational language. Would you be willing to hear a question of mine? Would you be willing to stop for a moment and listen to me? Allow a little bit of space, and then maybe do that. It's called an emotional deposit, which softens things always. And that the emotional deposit could be what you said. I really do care and I love you both. However, not but, that wipes out what you just said. But however, it's very painful for me to see you fighting like this. That sounds really simple and maybe elementary in nature. That could be powerful for your parents. That's a tough situation, and that might be a start in that situation. I have another question. It's been texted. Another question related to, again, this change. My husband and I are empty nesters. Well, my wife and I we should start a club or some sort of committee here, but this idea that my husband and I are empty nesters, we have children from previous marriages. My husband is a recent empty nester and is still adjusting. How can I be supportive and have empathy when I'm more ready for a more unattached life, i.e. less of a caretaker position? Sounds like. This sounds very complex, actually. But we have children, previous marriages, you're saying, that my husband is a recent empty nester and still adjusting. So how can I be supportive and have empathy when I'm ready for more of an attached life? Does it sound like to you the question is like, I'm kind of glad that we're empty nesters, so I want to be detached rather than attached in this situation? Are you hearing it that way? Or okay.
Did I also hear that she'd previously been an empty nester? She's already had that experience?
It didn't say previous. It says my husband, a recent empty nester. So it sounds, you're right. It sounds like indirectly that she may have been.
Already. So anytime we've already experienced something, it's like, sometimes we can have the reaction to others who are now going through that struggle of like, okay, but I'm ready to get on with it, right? Especially when it's our partners.
Yes.
But this is also a huge and wonderful opportunity to insert empathy, right? Not just sympathy. Like,
what's the difference?
So I'll put it in my words.
Okay, please.
It's not an absolute definition, but sympathy is looking at someone from sort of a distance, figuratively, and saying, oh, poor baby over there.
Right.
Right. And empathy is actually walking with somebody in their pain. And believe it or not, that experience of empathy allows the person to move on faster. So if you really want your partner to move out of a funk, sometimes the best way is to sit with them and to really, really use that empathy. Now, empathy in this experience, if I was reading that question correctly, she's already experienced this. So she probably remembers some degree of pain. So to be able to draw upon that takes tremendous emotional strength, but it could really, really be a resource in this particular case to having real empathy for their partner.
Yes. So when we look at empathy and to sit with a person, and I'm feeling uncomfortable, like I used the word again, I used it earlier, tolerating a level of anxiety. We as healthy people tend to be able to tolerate, which means that I can take a deep breath, back up from a situation. I can say, I'm not interested in participating right at this moment. However, I'd be happy to come back if you are. Come back and discuss it. That's tolerating anxiety. Tolerating anxiety is when there is an aggressive situation that you become assertive, like I'm a bit uncomfortable with where this is headed. I'm not sure I can continue if it's at this level of powerful in exchange. And you're actually leveling your own. We call it homeostasis. Like if it's too hot in the room, your body would automatically begin to perspire to cool your body down. So it's homeostasis in a calm place. So when we're looking at that related to this whole idea of sitting with someone, it's being able, you said it's difficult. It is, because I'm somehow having to calm my own anxiety because I've already been through this, if we're following this question correctly, and also say, yet I want to try to understand what you're experiencing. Because if we've experienced something, we want to tell others what they're experiencing, right? We all know this in pastoral ministry. If you have someone that's been through something and they've not had healthy work through it, and you put them in that leadership role, they'll tell everybody what to do because they already know. They've been through it, right? Sometimes that can be a dangerous place when somebody has been through something. Unless they've worked through it, they can then be very artful and helpful and nurturing of people because they are able to tolerate their own anxiety about it and have empathy for self. Then they can extend that empathy to others. It's back to the great command. Remember, Jesus was asked, what was the greatest command? And they asked, and they know the Mosaic Law, the 10 Commandments, but what's the greatest? And he said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So the more self-empathy you have, which is that self-acceptance we started with, the more empathy you will have for others. So it's being able to sit with that mate. Well, we've just about run out of time. We have 2 minutes left. And would you join me in thanking Patria Wen for being with us this evening, her presentation and background? Thank you so much. If I may, quickly, you have the brochure in front of you. On Tuesday, September 4, we have what is called Building Relationships with Our Children to Last a Lifetime. Dr. Joe Price comes once a year. I wish I could get him to come more often, but he's so gracious to come. He's absolutely spectacular. He is the person that Robin and I, over the years, he and his wife, we have gone to them for parenting counseling, and they've been gracious to help us. When it's not professional, he's not a licensed therapist that I know of, but go out to dinner and meet with them, and otherwise it'd be a dual relationship here. But I have so much confidence in him. His PhD is in child development. He works with adoption agencies and helps adoptees because he was adopted as a child. He's very empathetic, knows the Bible, and he knows science. very well. He's a full-time researcher. They allow him to just maybe teach a couple classes because he can do a lot of research. So if you'll join us and invite others, September 4. Thank you again for coming this evening. We're going to have a word of prayer, and then we are dismissed for the evening. Father, thank you so much for the gift of your presence that makes all the difference. Words are really powerful and poignant and very helpful to us, but your presence makes all the difference, your presence in our lives. So as you've met with us, you'll go with us, guide us in all of this. The greatest gift we have, Father, you know you've given this to us, is the gift of reflection, the ability to think about and be able to reflect upon life and issues. It's really one of the greatest gifts. So bless these wonderful people. Guide us now, and we give you praise for what you've accomplished and will through our lives as we leave here this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again for coming to My Therapist Says. Good evening.